Resuming debate, the honourable member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's always an honour to rise on behalf of the outstanding constituents of Oshawa and speak to this point of privilege. And I just want to take this opportunity as well to wish members in the House, but my constituents in Oshawa, a very Merry Christmas. I don't know if I'll have an opportunity to rise in the House again, but certainly we need some more Christmas spirit around here. But I think, Mr. Speaker, the best Christmas gift we could get the people of Oshawa would be a carbon tax election, because this government is not worth the cost or the corruption. My speech this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, is going to be more or less about censorship, disinformation, and misinformation. The Liberal government is moving down a spiral of authoritarianism, and this is a very deceptive government that is definitely not about transparency, as they originally promised, but it's a government using every single legislative tool to censor and control. Mr. Speaker, around the world, we're constantly seeing government censorship to silence opposing opinions, suppress transparency and accountability, and consolidate power. We see this form of government censorship in several countries: Russia, China, North Korea, and Canada? Yes, Mr. Speaker, Canada. After 9 years of the NDP-Liberal government, we are witnessing a new level of government censorship, more than ever before in Canada. Mr. Speaker, the issue today is about contempt of Parliament, and fraud. This government's censorship threatens the very foundations of our democracy. Without the ability to demand production of documents, speak our minds, express our views, and challenge the status quo, we are left with nothing but the hollow illusion of freedom. The government censorship we are witnessing here today is not about protecting Canadians from harm or ensuring public safety. Instead, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, it's about silencing dissent, shutting down debate, and consolidating power. It's about covering up for corruption and fraud. On this point of privilege, Madam Speaker, we are addressing government censorship regarding the failure to produce documents ordered by this House on the scandal involving the Sustainable Development Technology Canada, otherwise known as the Liberal billion-dollar green slush fund. However, while the power of the House is supposed to be supreme, the Prime Minister's personal department, the Privy Council office, decided to execute the order by telling departments to send in documents and censor them through redaction, to cover up corruption and to cover up fraud. This form of government censorship completely breaches a member's privilege because the order from the House did not say redact. The government has opted and chosen to defy the House, censor information of the SDTC documents at every single step of the way, as they don't want Canadians to know that through this green slush fund, $400 million has gone to Liberal insiders. Madam Speaker, and it may be twice that amount because the Auditor General couldn't complete the full audit. This scandal as well, which is really important to recognize, it compromises 2 current cabinet ministers and 1 former cabinet minister. Madam Speaker, I'd like to say that this is a surprise that the government would behave in this manner, but based on this government's track record, government censorship and fraud is nothing but the expected. In other words, Madam Speaker, for this government, it's business as usual. And perhaps this is a very good time for my colleagues to talk a little bit about a history lesson. Okay, remember the Liberal sponsorship scandal, Madam Speaker? Last time the Liberals were in power, they funneled $40 million to their friends and orchestrated a sophisticated kickback scheme. Then they got caught. Fraud, corruption, cover-ups, Madam Speaker. And the best predictor of future behavior, I would suggest, is past behavior. So the question is this SDTC scandal part of the latest Liberal kickback scandal? Where did the money go? This one scandal is at least 10 times greater than the sponsorship scandal. This is another in a long list of scandals that the Liberals are trying to cover up through censorship. And Madam Speaker, I should probably define what I mean by censorship. Censorship is the suppression or prohibition of any parts of books, films, news, etc. that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security. And I would suggest, Madam Speaker, that politically unacceptable is why the Liberal NDP government champions censorship. I should probably define a few other terms. Misinformation is the inadvertent spread of false information without intent to harm. Disinformation is false information designed to mislead others and is deliberately spread with the intent to confuse fact and fiction. And another word, Madam Speaker, it's a controversial new term. It's called malinformation. Okay, this is used to describe this Liberal NDP government, a term for information which is based on fact but removed from its original context in order to mislead, harm, or manipulate. In other words, malinformation, it's true but inconvenient for the government and its narrative. Madam Speaker, under the guise of combating disinformation and hate speech, this government has implemented policies that give it the power to silence voices, censor information, and withhold documents that do not conform to its own woke ideological agenda. And this censorship is spreading across Canada through our institutions, not just here in the House of Commons. We saw this last week when an independent journalist, Ezra Levant, was arrested for simply filming and reporting on a pro-Hamas rally occurring in his own neighborhood. Instead of arresting provocative pro-Hamas supporters who spewed hate, celebrating genocide while chanting from the river to the sea, an independent member of the press was arrested for simply doing his job, arrested by the very police who have sworn to protect his charter rights. Madam Speaker, and we wonder why Canadians are questioning whether or not this is the country they grew up in. When a Jewish man gets arrested by Toronto police in his own neighborhood while supporting a vigil for families whose loved ones were massacred and kidnapped on October the 7th, while members of the hateful mob are allowed to continue their mockery of the victim's suffering, we have to ask ourselves why the government condones this hateful behavior and censors first-hand accounts of cruel anti-Semitism and supports police who discriminate. When governments and our institutions condone this behavior, it is as if it gives a stamp of approval, and that definitely is not okay. And what about this government's history of pushing through authoritative legislation? Let's take a look at that, Madam Speaker. Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, according to the NDP-Liberals, aims to modernize the Broadcasting Act. However, it harms Canadian digital creators by limiting their services and ability to reach global audiences. It also allows government boundless powers to regulate digital content and give it the authority to control what Canadians can and cannot access online. This is a direct assault on the freedoms of expression and access to information that have flourished, Madam Speaker, in this digital age. Instead of letting Canadians choose for themselves what to watch and listen to, the government seeks to impose its own narrative, prioritizing state-approved content over independent voices and diverse viewpoints. Our young, bright Canadian content creators are being stifled. If other jurisdictions also decide to put forward legislation like this, that will mean that Canadian content will be a lower priority for the rest of the world, and that could damage our entertainment exports. And the government's censorship doesn't stop there, Madam Speaker. Bill C-18, the Online News Act, also allows this government to get in the way of what people can see and share online. This bill requires internet companies to distribute royalties to newspapers whose content is shared on the site. It demonstrates the government choosing to side with large corporate media while shutting down small, local, and independent news, as well as giving far too much power to the government to regulate without limitation. As a result, local and independent media outlets that might challenge the government's narrative are left vulnerable, and those who conform, Madam Speaker, are rewarded. Common sense conservatives believe that we need to find a solution in which Canadians can continue to freely access news content online in addition to fairly compensating Canadian news outlets. However, when we offered amendments to the bill that would address these several issues, the NDP and the Liberals voted them down. Another bill, Bill C-63, is another testament to this government's continuous commitment to censorship. The Online Harms Act creates costly censorship bureaucracy that doesn't make it easier for people experiencing legitimate online harassment to access justice. Instead, it will act as a regulatory process that won't start for years and will happen behind closed doors where big tech lobbyists can pull the strings. The common sense conservative alternative to the bill, to the Online Harms Act, Online Harms Act is Bill C-412, proposed by my colleague from Calgary Nose Hill. It will keep Canadians safe online without infringing on their civil liberties. It will give Canadians more protections online through existing regulators and the justice system, and outline a duty of care for online operators to keep kids safe online while prohibiting a digital ID and giving parents more tools. And for another outrageous example of withholding documents and censoring information, let's not forget the cover-up at the Winnipeg Lab, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Liberals allowed scientists loyal to the Chinese Communist Party to work at our most secure lab. They gave them a Canadian taxpayer-funded salary, allowed them to send dangerous pathogens back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they work on gain-of-function research, then would expose the Liberals, who we know admire the basic dictatorship of China, let these scientists escape the country without proper investigation. When Parliament asked for these documents, Madam Speaker, the Liberals actually took their own Liberal Speaker to court and then censored our ability to disclose those documents by calling an early election. And we still haven't found out what happened there. Madam Speaker, on top of censoring Parliament, let us not forget about this NDP-Liberal government's track record of censoring individual expression. We have seen countless individuals, physicians, scientists, and organizations being punished for simply speaking out against this government policies. The government froze bank accounts. People were labeled as promoting hate speech and disinformation or conspiracy theorists, racists, and misogynists by their own Prime Minister. And we were warned that this could happen. Madam Speaker, in one of his final interviews, esteemed scientist Carl Sagan noted that we've arranged a society on science and technology in which nobody understands anything about science and technology. And this combustible mixture of ignorance and power sooner or later is going to blow up in our faces. I mean, who is running the science and technology in a democracy if the people don't know anything about it? We've seen this technocracy weaponized by governments during COVID pandemic through various unjustifiable mandates and government censorship surrounding medical research. Madam Speaker, and now the new head of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, Marty Makary, has on the record said that the greatest perpetrator of misinformation during the pandemic has been the United States government, and it's the same here in Canada. The weaponization of medical research is not just an American issue. Dr. Regina Wattil, a PhD in statistics, has written Fisman's Fraud, an excellent expose on the rise of Canadian hate science. Her books expose how the Liberal government, through repeated grants from CIHR, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, hired Dr. David Fisman, a researcher for hire from the University of Toronto Medical School, to manipulate COVID statistics to support a failing government policy. He was touted, Madam Speaker, as an expert, but his only expertise was manipulating statistics to support government overreach. His sham studies were used to justify some of the most draconian COVID policies in the world and were quoted extensively by the Liberal-friendly media. And any criticism of Fisman's fraudulent statistical analysis has been shut down and censored. Again, Madam Speaker, this is a Canadian example of a result that Carl Sagan warned us about decades ago, the fall into technocracy where government-sanctioned expert opinion trumps hard scientific data. Sadly, the government's censorship has now extended to our judicial systems and other institutions, including the Parole Board of Canada. Madam Speaker, while the Liberal Justice Minister brags about appointing 800 judges out of the 957 positions, we can see that the soft-on-crime consequences of this woke ideological agenda. We saw an outrageous example of this last week when the French Mahaffey families desired to participate in the parole hearing of their daughter's brutal murderer. And locally, Lisa Freeman, a constituent in Oshawa, and the inspiration behind my private member's bill, Bill C-320, was recently informed by the Parole Board of Canada that the axe murderer who brutally murdered her father while on parole at the time, will be subject to a closed-door review. In the past, Ms. Freeman has been denied her rights as a registered victim and as a result has been continually re-victimized, only this time by the very institutions that should be putting the safety and her mental health and safety and the safety of victims first. Attending and meaningfully participating in an in-person hearing to deliver a victim statement is not only fair and reasonable, but well within Ms. Freeman's rights as per the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights under the right of participation. It's crucial that Ms. Freeman be able to express the emotional pain and turmoil that the murder of her father caused and continues to cause. She also deserves to be able to gauge for herself accountability of the offender. This is something she has previously been unable to ascertain. The brutal murder of her father has not only vastly impacted her life and the lives of her loved ones, but also continues to cause post-traumatic stress exacerbated by the complete lack of care by the Parole Board of Canada for her rights as a victim. It is completely unacceptable that Ms. Freeman is now once again being censored by the Parole Board of Canada as they plan to make a closed-door decision regarding the offender's continuation of day parole and full parole without holding a hearing. And Madam Speaker, it's shameful that this NDP government seems to care more about censoring victims than keeping repeat offenders off the street. What they don't understand is the government's censorship does not fulfill the requirement of protecting people from harm in society. Instead, government censorship is the harm to society which threatens our fundamental democratic values that we should be championing. To quote the famous author George Orwell, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." The Marxist communist Vladimir Lenin once said, "Why should freedom of speech and freedom of press be allowed? Why should a government which is doing what it believes to be right allow itself to be criticized? It would not allow opposition by lethal weapons. Ideas are much more fatal than guns. Why should any man be allowed to buy a printing press and disseminate pernicious opinions calculated to embarrass the government?" Madam Speaker, more and more we are seeing these quotes and these Marxist ideas becoming implemented under this NDP-Liberal government. And we must stand up for the idea that truth is not something that can be determined by the state. We must insist that Canadian citizens, not censoring politicians, should be the ones to decide what information they believe, what opinions and values they hold, and what content with which they engage. We must continue to reject the government's idea that censorship is the solution to every problem, and it may be the solution to their problems, and instead embrace the idea that freedom of expression and freedom of conscience are part of the solution to a more free and prosperous Canadian society. Justice Potter Stewart said, "Censorship reflects a society's lack of confidence in itself. It is the hallmark of an authoritative regime." And that's what we see with this tired, divisive, Liberal government today, Madam Speaker, and Canadians have indeed lost confidence in this weak Prime Minister and the corrupt Liberal Party. If we allow government to censor the rights of the people's elected representatives, the internet squash individuality, opinions, expression, curtail our freedoms of movement, then indeed the Marxists have won the ideological war. Madam Speaker, in closing, Canada is not the greatest country in the world simply because I say it is. Canada is the greatest country in the world because we care and fight for our fundamental democratic values. We have a history of that, which people from around the world in other countries would love to have. So these values must not be taken for granted. When we in Oshawa sing our national anthem, we take the true north strong and free to heart. This current SDTC scandal, the refusal of the NDP-Liberal government to release requested unredacted documents to the people's representatives, threaten the very essence of our democracy. And our democracy that generations, Madam Speaker, of Canadians died to protect must be respected and fought for. At our cenotaphs, at our service clubs, and in the sacred House of Commons, the people's voices will be heard. Madam Speaker, I'd like to say that Canadians are listening today, and they have a core identity. We are proud Canadians. We are not a first post-national state. And when people ask us which country we admire the most, we don't say that we admire the basic dictatorship of China. We say we admire Canada. And thank you, Madam Speaker. And hopefully, like most things that criticize the government, such as this speech, the Liberal NDPs don't decide to censor it. So let's see what they have to say.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Honourable Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And actually, where I wanted to pick up was exactly where that speech ended, because I am sure that all the members in this place are well aware that we just heard a long speech that was highly critical of this government that will not be censored. In fact, that is exactly what happens in this country. We do actually allow for freedom of expression. It is in our charter. But if I just wanted to pick up on the beginning of the speech, where I believe the member opposite said that we were akin to North Korea. And I was hoping that perhaps he could elaborate on that, because that certainly doesn't seem to be the experience of most Canadians, but I would like to know how he sees us being akin to North Korea. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Madam Speaker, what I said is the rise of censorship around the world. And what I did is I included Canada in that and this government. The reason I did that, Madam Speaker, is because the evidence is very clear. If you look at the last time they pulled this stunt, a very similar stunt, it was with the Winnipeg Lab, where they refused to give this House documents. And what were they hiding, Madam Speaker? This is what Canadians really want to know. We've heard the Liberals throughout this entire debate. They don't want to actually talk about the essence of what we're talking about here today. And it's the right of Parliament, the supremacy of Parliament to be able to order these documents and see them for the people's representatives. And what are they doing? Instead of releasing them, they're making this debate go on and on and on. And each time they get up, instead of actually debating us on it, they bring up another issue. So when I'm talking about censorship and comparing us to other countries that are perhaps much more authoritarian, it's a warning, Madam Speaker, because we're heading in that direction and Canadians don't want us in that direction.
Des commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker. I mean, it was a crazy speech, just wacky. The first part being, of course, that is because of NDP MPs that we got to the bottom of the SNC-Lavalin scandal and getting to the bottom of the SDTC scandal as well. In each case, the We Charity as well. NDP has played a key role. But we do know when authoritarian tendencies took place in this country, and that member was in this House during the dismal nightmare years of the Harper regime, where Parliament was shut down and padlocked by Harper and his cronies so that we couldn't get to the bottom of any of the scandals. And I can just mention them because he's well aware of them. The G8 scandal was $1 billion. The ETS scandal was $400 million. The Phoenix Pay scandal was $2.2 billion. And I could go on and on. The Senate scandals, it was a scandal every single day. Every single day, the Harper regime and the cronies in the House of Commons shut down any sort of debate, shut down any sort of parliamentary inquiry, shut down committees. It was a nightmare. And the nightmare ended in 2015 when we finally got rid of the Harper regime and the corruption and the scandals and the cronyism and the refusal to allow Parliament to do its job. Does the member have any sense of shame of his participation in all of those events?
The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Madam Speaker, we see again the NDP standing up in this House, and instead of actually debating me about what I was talking about, censorship, they're taking action that I guess the person that they really respect and look up to. I'm going to read a quote from one of the NDP's favorite authors. His name's Vladimir Lenin. He said, "It is, of course, much easier to shout, abuse, and howl than attempt to relate or to explain." Now, Madam Speaker, this is...
For New Westminster Burnaby on a point of order, specifically.
The appalling ignorance of this member is really...
It's not a point of order. That is a matter of debate. I am going to let the Honourable Member for Oshawa attempt to answer the question.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I always enjoy this member when he gets up and he goes way over the top, because what we're talking about is $400 million that has gone missing, that his party has stood in this House repeatedly to support this government. Now, the last time it happened, it was $40 million with the sponsorship. This one scandal, Madam Speaker, $400 million. And the principle is that Parliament is supreme. We have the right to see these documents. And He's causing this mess because he's supporting that government.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Dauphin, Swan River, Nipawin.
We'll bring everything back into the $400 million, just in details. $58 million to 10 ineligible projects. $334 million in over 186 cases to projects where board members were in conflict of interest. $58 million to projects without guaranteeing terms and conditions were met. This is what we've been standing on our hands and heads and trying to get the government's attentions to release these documents. And the Liberal government does not seem to give a wing-ding about this. So can the member please let me know what he thinks about these numbers?
The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Yeah, wing-ding actually does work, Madam Speaker. And you see how the Liberals are heckling right now because what they want to do, Madam Speaker, is talk about anything else than the corruption and scandal and what they're actually trying to hide. And we see heckling from the NDP again as usual. But, Madam Speaker, Canadians in Oshawa, my constituents, are actually sick and tired of this. I actually did a survey in Oshawa and I asked my constituents if they're sick and tired of this. Are they fed up? And do they want an election? And out of the 600 responses we've gotten so far, and we're getting a lot of responses, 98% of respondents want a carbon tax election now because they're sick and tired of the corruption of this Liberal government and sick and tired of an opposition party, the NDP, supporting them in each and every step of the way.
Honourable Member for St. John Rothsay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thanks to the member opposite. You know, Madam Speaker, I come here week in and week out. I want to do work for my constituents. I want to do work for the country. I want to be up on this House. I want to be talking about things like the housing accelerator. Some Conservatives wanted it, some didn't, some wanted it but couldn't speak for it because their leader wouldn't let them. It was unbelievable. I want to speak, Madam Speaker, about the Canada Child Benefit, childcare, the school food program, but we can't because we are involved in this debacle week in and week out. There's obviously one speech, it's like a Christmas fruitcake that gets handed from member to member. I'm tired of listening to the same thing, but the question I have for the member opposite is, what is up with the foreign interference with respect to the leadership? That's what I want to know. What's up? Calgary Nose Hill was clearly approached by foreign actors asking her to pull out. So I want to ask the member, what happened? Clear the air. Let's be transparent. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Madam Speaker, again, the member wants to talk about anything other than what we're talking about here today. This is one of the members, too, of the Liberal Party who actually signed a letter to kick out the Prime Minister because he has no confidence in it, which I think you'll get a lot of support on this side. Madam Speaker, as far as foreign interference is concerned, let's just talk about the Prime Minister statement that he admires the basic dictatorship of China, okay? And the cash for access fundraisers that he had early on. Do people around here actually remember that? Does he remember the $100 million, or what was the amount that they gave to the Trudeau Foundation in order to buy influence with this Prime Minister who openly receives it? Madam Speaker, his ideology is not Canadians' ideology. Like I said in my speech, when Conservatives are asked which country do they admire the most, they do not say they admire the basic dictatorship of China. They say they admire Canada and our democracy and the principles that we stand for. And Parliament is supreme. Release the documents.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Deputy House Leader. Yes.
Conservatives are continually avoiding to answer one of the questions that is out there in the media right now, Madam Speaker. Right now, today, tonight, it was reported that 5 people very close to Patrick Brown's campaign team in 2022 that led to the leadership of the member from Carleton, the current leader of the opposition. 5 people knew that the leader, or that the Conservative member from Calgary Nose Hill, was approached by Indian diplomats trying to influence her support away from Patrick Brown. Does this member not think that Canadians have the right to know if there are foreign actors that are trying to interfere in the electoral process in Canada? Yes or no? Do they have the right to know? And should the member from Calgary Nose Hill come to the Public Safety Committee to provide answers to that question?
Brief answer from the honourable member for Oshawa.
Madam Speaker, I believe the member from Calgary Nose Hill already put out a statement on that, but I'm going to read him another quote from their friends Vladimir Lenin. He said, "Truth is the most precious things, that's why we should ration it." His former environment minister actually said, but you know, we gave them some real advice.
Time.